No monarch since Henry VIII exploited the privileges of being a king more than Charles II. By the end of his reign, Charles had become notorious for his lavish lifestyle. On February the 1st, 1685, in his Whitehall Palace in London, Charles had a typically extravagant night. While members of his court were gambling with thousands of pounds of gold coins, Charles was busy entertaining two of his mistresses. After 25 excessive years on the throne, that Sunday night was the king's final party. Until Charles became king, London had been a city in tatters after a decade of strict rule under Cromwell.
London, till 1660, had been a very depressed city. Trade was down, it's wartime conditions. It was Puritan rule, and so the churches wouldn't have had any ceremonies or feast days. Christmas had been literally abolished, maypoles cut down. Suddenly in 1660, all these things can come back with the monarchy. So the monarchy stands for the return of the good old days.
Charles triumphantly returned from exile as the restored monarch and was determined to show off his newfound magnificence and exploit his royal privileges.
Charles's decadence manifests itself in acceptable and unacceptable ways. Acceptable ways is discovering new pleasures and introducing them to the English ruling class. It seems to be Charles II who introduced the English champagne, croquet and yachting, things which the rich have sported with ever since.
But Charles's greatest indulgence was a coterie of mistresses, an extravagance that sprang from a serious royal dilemma.
My own theory about Charles is that the turning point is his marriage. His wife is barren. She can't conceive a child. And I think Charles needs to parade before the land the fact it's not his fault, that he is prodigiously fertile, and the fact there isn't an heir to the throne is entirely down to his wife.
Charles initially attempted to keep his mistresses secret by shipping them down the Thames at night. But he soon became the subject of public rumour.
This is only a dozen years since adultery was given the death penalty in England. Now, fortunately for everybody, including Charles, that's been repealed at the Restoration, but this is not a land that approves of monkeying around with marital relations. The gossip columnists of the day, all the way from the serious gossip columnists around the court to pubs at the far end of Wales, were discussing the king's sexual antics and making up rhymes and songs about them.
Even Charles's friend, the Earl of Rochester, was scathing, writing, "His sceptre and his prick are of a length. Restless he rolls about from whore to whore, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor."
Nobody in the aristocracy in the 17th century believes in safe sex. The only condoms available are made of animal intestine, and they're a wonderful barrier to pleasure. And the king certainly doesn't bother with them. So he's quite vulnerable to disease.
The disease that 17th century Londoners like Charles feared most was the pox, what we now call syphilis.
I would have thought that syphilis at the end of the 17th century was almost as common as AIDS is in Greater London today. Probably much more common, in fact. You can almost say that anybody who'd been anybody, who'd been around town, who'd been part of society, would have actually contracted the pox sooner or later. People were moving in and out of London from other countries. Sailors were around the whole time. You have to remember, ships came right up into London at that time. And where you have sailors, you always have venereal disease. You always have prostitutes. Sailors come back from their barges, they get money, they spend it on drink and women. Nowadays, in general, we see very few cases of early infectious syphilis. In my practice, we wouldn't see more than about 10 a year.
Whether he had it or not, Charles must have been concerned about catching syphilis.
Charles II may well have had syphilis, though we cannot be absolutely sure whether he had it.
The king certainly was very familiar with people who did have the pox. Doctors now believe that Nell Gwynn, a Cockney actress from Drury Lane who became Charles's most famous mistress, probably had syphilis which infected her brain and drove her mad.
We know she died at the relatively early age of 36. We know that if you sleep with somebody who has syphilis and you do not use a condom, there's probably about a 1 in 3 chance of contracting syphilis.
Charles also experimented with mercury, the most gruesome treatment for the pox. But even if he had syphilis, mercury might not have helped.
Mercury might have had a weak effect on syphilis, but at the most a pretty weak effect. But what is more worrying are the side effects of mercury. You've heard of the phrase, as mad as a hatter. Well, the hatters were men in the 19th century who rubbed mercury into rabbit skins to make very nice hats. It made the fur very, very nice and smooth. But if you do this all your life, you start to get a very curious mental state. It makes you rather withdrawn and timid, and you dart around. And that's one of the things that happens. The other thing that happens with mercury is it is a very potent kidney poison.
For most of his life, Charles showed no outward signs of syphilis or kidney poisoning. But the drama surrounding his death overshadowed the numerous possible causes. On his last night of health, Charles ate a typically extravagant meal, including a rare delicacy, 2 goose eggs. Over the next 5 days, not only the luxuries of Charles's life, but also the efforts of his doctors were to get the better of him and leave Britain with the biggest political crisis since the Civil War.
The first sign that something is wrong with the king is that he sleeps badly. The king always sleeps attended when he's not with a girlfriend, and we have it in the authority of his pages that he's a very sound sleeper, but that night he tossed and turned and murmured in his sleep. He gets up in the morning and something is obviously wrong. He's absolutely ashy pale.
Unable to speak, Charles suddenly started having a fit. His physician and surgeon, Edmund King, was on hand and immediately decided to draw a pint of blood from Charles's arm to stop the convulsions. In the meantime, the rest of Charles's personal physicians were summoned, a cavalcade of Britain's most expensive and supposedly best medical talents, all brought to work on a single patient. To understand and treat Charles's illness, his doctors used the idea of the 4 humours.
The theory of the 4 humours is a very old theory that originates from ancient Greece. Greek doctors, scientists and philosophers were all looking for a way to explain illness, other than previous civilizations which had resorted to using religion and superstition. The Greeks came up with the idea that the body comprised 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. Whilst these were in a state of balance, a person could enjoy good health. But when these became unbalanced, illness resulted.
Rather than using specific cures for particular diseases, Charles's doctors believed that any illness could be driven away by restoring his humours. But the way that they set about treating the king was horrifying.
He is then tortured comprehensively by his doctors, to the great admiration of the scientific community who think they're doing just the right thing.
For 4 days, Charles was burned with hot irons to remove blood. Blistering agents were applied to his feet and his head to burst his skin and make him bleed.
He's given purges, enemas, he's given vomits, he's given scalding urine because he's made to drink stuff that turns your water hot. In many ways, he suffers worse than a prisoner in the Tower of London being interrogated for treason.
His skin was cut open and blood was sucked out of it with heated cupping glasses.
The bleeding, in particular, was enormous. And they begin by taking blood from the veins in his arm, but they go for jugular, literally. They try and open up the great veins in the neck. And on one occasion, a tired surgeon misses and actually cuts the wrong part of the king's throat open. And an expert has to step in, staunch the blood, and then open up the real vein, the jugular itself, to make the blood pour out into a basin. Now, this is not a good way of bolstering a body to handle illness.
Charles Scarborough, the king's chief physician, also recorded in his notes the huge variety of drugs that Charles was given, some of which were so weird and wonderful that only a king could afford to buy them.
An enema made of rock salt and syrup of buckthorn to drain away the humours. An emetic of 1/2 ounce of orange infusion of metals in white wine to rid the nervous system of impurities. White hellebore root applied to the nostrils to excite sneezing. His most serene majesty's strength is gradually failing.
To a modern eye, the really bizarre thing about this is that all this regime of torture and murder is described in great detail and great pride by the doctors, and they're universally admired.
On the 4th day of Charles's illness, his doctors announced that they had cured the king with their proper and seasonable remedies. But the truth gradually began to leak out. The doctors could do very little to keep Charles alive. They now resorted to even the most supernatural of remedies to save the king.
He was actually given a spirit of human skull. The skull itself supposedly had to be that of a person who'd experienced a very violent death. And the idea was that the patient, being aware of this, would be shocked in pulling himself together. In other words, it was a last-ditch attempt.
Things which appear just utterly supernatural to us, bits of Egyptian mummy, and herbs and simples which are valued more for their symbolic than for their medical value.
The final hope was treatment with the bezoar stone, the gallstone of a rare Indian goat. Although this was unlikely to help Charles recover, his highly paid doctors were determined to be seen to be trying every possible treatment.
During the 5 days of the king's illness, 58 different treatments had been applied by 14 different physicians. Charles II really had been at the mercy of his doctors. All types of exotic treatments had been applied to the king in order to restore his health. But at the end of the day, the illness which took the king could not be treated. The medical knowledge was not available for those around.
Nobody knows whether Charles's illness was sparked off by food poisoning, overindulgence, or even kidney failure from mercury exposure. But his eventual death was due to the last extravagance he could call on: his bevy of doctors.
On the Friday, it's reported that Charles woke up at about 6 a.m. He'd regained enough strength to ask that the curtains of his room be opened so that he could see the dawn for the last time. It was clear that the king was dying. His family and his mistresses had been called the night before to say their farewells. By 10 o'clock, the king was in a coma, and at this stage it was decided that he should be left in peace.
Within 2 hours, Charles II had died, and Britain was left with the biggest constitutional crisis since the Civil War.
In every sense, Charles II dies at a particularly bad time. Nobody expects him to die then. He's in good health and only in early middle age. And also, he dies leaving 3 different claimants to the throne, which is a nightmare situation for any monarchy. So the price of Charles dropping dead at that moment is likely to be civil war and revolution. In fact, England gets both within 4 years.
Charles II became a victim of the extravagance that comes with being king. Even the luxury of the best medicine money could buy eventually became a threat to his life. It wasn't until George IV, 140 years later, that a king would misbehave in such an ostentatious way again. And this time, it would threaten the monarchy itself.